issue of housing insecurity and housing as a human right. I'm Deb Savaris, the CEO of the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, the peak body for children and families in Victoria and Tasmania. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of and custodians of the land on which we're all joining from today. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri Country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people joining us today. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and this is and will always be Aboriginal land. So, as I said, it's fantastic to be with you all today. I know it is a year this week since the Voice referendum was defeated. So many people worked so hard to make First Nations people and provide that voice to Parliament. And the reverberations of this rejection continue to play out today. And it's really important during this week, as many First Nations people are thinking about the opportunities lost in that space, more we need to do. This is relevant to our session this morning as First Nations autonomy to make choices about how to live, whether this is through home ownership or affordable rental properties or a range of other Aboriginal-led housing outcomes, is fundamental to self-determination. The Centre has advocated for housing to be regarded as a fundamental right for every child and their family for as long as I can remember. Anti-Poverty Week, however, reminds us of the critical importance of a secure and stable home in creating a safe and nurturing environment for children, young people and their families. This is the Centre's second time running an event as part of Anti-Poverty Week, and I want to quickly acknowledge David Tennant from Family Care, Jenny Davidson from the Council of Single Mothers and Their Children, and Bronwyn, Pike and her team at Uniting, who've been part of making this event happen today. We know we're preaching this morning when we have these conversations, but they're still vitally important to keep the conversations going and for all of us to gather together to talk about this really significant issue. Our advocacy needs to be year-long and relentless, and I'd have to say for those advocates that are in the room today, many of you, this is lifelong work. So not just during Anti-Poverty Week should we be talking about this. We need to keep pressure on governments, developers and communities to invest in housing for all children and their families, and to shift the public discourse from housing as an asset to housing as a human right, an issue that is on everyone's minds right now. And I have to say, if you turn the television on in the morning, it seems to be one of the top issues that everybody's talking about. So every person in this webinar today is aware that we're living through a national housing crisis. The cost of housing in this country is the highest it's ever been, and it is those on the lowest incomes who are most affected. Families who rely on government income support are being priced out of rentals. In Victoria alone, there were nearly 62,000 people on the public housing waiting list in June this year, an increase of around 3,000 since March. The 2021 census shows young people making up 25% of the homeless population nationally, although this is likely an underestimation given that couch surfing may hide the true extent of housing insecurity. Nationally, at the federal level, the conversation around housing is starting to change. Senator David Pocock's private members bill, the National Housing and Homelessness Bill plan, reflects a reconceptualisation from an asset to a fundamental human right. In his recently published book, Housing, The Great Australian Right, the Honourable Kevin Bell argues that today's housing crisis has its roots in policies which have treated housing as an economic investment, encouraging property to be accumulated in the interests of private wealth creation in the hands of a few, rather than as a social investment linked to people's welfare. I'd have to say, in preparing these notes, and some of you on this call are of my generation, I remember the great Brian Howe's great housing strategy of its time many years ago. So there's been some great work done historically in this space, but who knew we would be in this space that we're in now? This book recognises that housing is connected to a family, community, one's workplace, one's educational opportunities and access to health services. The very things that support someone's social existence. The importance of housing stability in sustaining social existence was confirmed in a recent centre survey of over 100 of our members who provide services to children and families. And I want to say many of our members are housing and homelessness organisations, as well as provide services for children and their families. But this survey alone found that around 85% of these organisations, our members, regardless of their specialisation, regularly provide support to families experiencing housing insecurity. There's been a change in the client populations coming to services for housing support, with more employed families seeking assistance than previously. And those on this call would know this. I'm just reiterating what your lived experience. Service providers are finding more families experiencing homelessness due to increased costs of living, inability to secure housing in the private rental market, limited social housing availability, and excessively long wait lists for public housing. The survey results showed a range of impacts on families associated with housing insecurity were depression, stress across all aspects of life, having to remain in unsafe environments because there is nowhere else for these families to go. Service providers also reported a lot of fear around child removal. This meant there's a lot of anxiety in our families around having children removed, with organisations reporting that many families are going without food or essential items. Children haven't been able to attend school, including difficulty in enrolling or attending regularly. Much of this has been known to us for some time, but when you keep talking about it in the way that we are, it's incredibly frustrating. The survey also showed how profoundly children are caught up in their families' housing stress. Governments do really need to hear more directly from children. The 11-year-old Ran, who wrote to his local MP this week describing his concerns about the impact of poverty and housing insecurity on young people, and that letter that was read out in Parliament. Decision makers know about how the housing needs of children, and this is one of the key themes we will be discussing in today's webinar. How do we make sure that the impact of housing stress on children is recognised and that their basic needs for safety, stability and security are met? How can we make sure no family has to live in unsafe and unstable environments which affect education, healthcare and employment? It's a pleasure in this webinar today. I mean, for those of you who know me well, I spent many years in the housing and homelessness space. That's very dear to my heart, and it's so nice for me to be back talking about these issues. But that's enough from me. I'd like now to introduce our keynote for this morning. I'd like now to introduce our first presenter of the session, Dr. Heather Holst. Heather is a Commissioner for Residential Tenancies here in Victoria. She would be well known to many of you, she's certainly well known to me. Heather is an expert, and we know this because most of us look to her for advice in this space, but an expert in tenancy, homelessness and affordable housing policy with experience across service delivery, organisational management, policy development and research. Prior to her role as the Victorian Commissioner for Residential Tenancies, Heather was the Deputy CEO at Launch Housing after working for many years in the community sector. And we're very proud to have Launch Housing as one of our members here at the centre. So it's wonderful to have them in our breach. Thank you so much, Heather. It's really nice to see your face. And welcome to have some discussions here this morning. Over to you.
Thanks, Deb. Good to see you too. As you say, we worked together for many years, yes, and good to still be working with you. So I always like to start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'll do that today. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining each other today. In my case, the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations in central Victoria. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and particularly extend my acknowledgement to any Aboriginal people joining us on the call today. The rates of child removal and intervention for Aboriginal families are well known to you all, I'm sure, but it is particularly apparent that nexus between housing and risk for children in the Aboriginal communities of Victoria and the rest of Australia. The URUC first report had, 11 to 1 is the ratio of Aboriginal child removals. And then Aboriginal children 10 to 17, 11 times more likely to be under youth justice observation. So it's a very real extreme situation that I'm afraid we all need to keep working on. Yeah. But I'm going to talk to you today in more general terms, I guess, about housing insecurity, the impact for children, and, you know, the broader family as well, on which children all rely. I want to talk to you about some of the things that are being done in the policy sense now, and invite you, I think, very much to join your voices if you're not already with those policy developments. And I also want to talk about a few of the really promising, I don't know, projects is quite the right word, but innovations that I know some of the members here are very much involved with. And then just a quick reflection on that whole human right question as well, which I'll thread throughout. So the meaning of housing insecurity for children, well, not having a childhood home where memories are formed, that your mind goes back to, that you learn things, you experience a sense of solidity, that when life's big blows do come to you, which they come to all of us, you do remember that things can be okay, that there's a fundamental okayness to life, because you've got that in your memory bank and in your very body, basically, that knowledge of security and something to return to fundamentally in your mind. But children who have to move around a lot or have periods in crisis accommodation, tents, cars, worried parents, worried children, as Deb points out quite rightly. That real, I don't know, it's not a gift, it's a birthright actually, of that knowledge of the foundation of security and stability and belonging isn't there. I find that a very unbearable thought actually, and something that certainly makes me work pretty hard to make right as much as possible. Look, the worried parents that I just touched on, that's no small thing, and that takes from the children. That worry, that preoccupation is a loss for every child. A shorter answer, not being able to focus on other things. That's a fundamental as well. And I think what we need to all be working on in our sectors is support for parents who can then be their very best, basically, with their children. Just sort of material things like poor sleep, ill health from poor housing that is too hot, it's too cold. Everyone's got colds all the time. Maybe they're catching other things, skin diseases. All those sort of things that are from overcrowded situations. It's just daily kind of it inhibits those children. They're short of money. In this talk, the advertisement for the talk, there was mention of the cost of living crisis. I think those of us in the sector have been working with people for a long time with the cost of living crisis, but that group, of course, is radically expanded right now. And that's something, again, as all Australians, we've got to be working on, haven't we? Yeah. Look, friendships as well, how to confidently make and keep friendships when you might have to move all the time, when you're always new, when perhaps you can't really invite anyone back to the house. All those sort of things really inhibit things for children as well, and undercut them. The proximity to extended family, as well as that friendship group, being able to keep pets, maybe to make a garden if there's a bit of space. All those sort of things are really contingent on being able to have a solid enough housing base. Also, that it's sort of okay to make a bit of noise and a bit of mess as well, without someone else having an opinion, really enforceable opinion on that. So I think that's a constraint on children that and their parents, that it causes unnecessary, anxiety, and just makes everything a little bit smaller. Yeah. There's still stigma against families who don't manage to provide good housing for their children. Many of the renters that I speak to and kind of try to represent into government, that's my role, is to hear from and amplify the voices of renters into policy making. Many of those families feel that stigma and feel that they aren't doing well enough by their children and themselves as a family. And that can be quite well-to-do renters still feeling that stigma. So that's not great, Australia. That's not great. And you know, again, we need to recognise that and work hard on it. Things can, of course, start to get very enduring in their effects. Discontinuity of education. I know you all work very hard on trying to address that, but that's immediately a problem, but it's a long-term problem as well. The massive nexus between child protection and the lack of housing, and Deb called that out in some of the things the members were saying in that survey. But that's real, and the failure to provide an adequate home is one of the factors that you know, many parents are asked to address in order to get their children returned or not to have their children removed, and that's a pretty hard one to address, of course. Developmental delays, we know that that's much more prevalent in children who are going through homelessness or the risk of homelessness. Also getting the help for those developmental delays, that needs a solid base to be able to do that work, to address that and catch up, which is work that can be done, but how to sort of get the stable moment to get those assessments and get all that into place, very hard. I also want to say, what about the grandparents? Because it's great if children do have that sort of access to grandparents. I attended a report launch yesterday. Swinburne University had written a report on behalf of Housing for the Aged Action Group about older women as the growing demographic in homelessness, and I think many of you will have heard that. So, you know, they're the grandmothers. They're the ones who ought to be in there as well, helping it all, easing the way, enjoying the children enjoying them, the parents having, you know, that safety net of the grandparents, particularly grandmothers. I'm going to call it out. I've just had my 4th grandchild, so I'm particularly aggressive about this, right? Yeah. So, you know, that don't underestimate, I suppose, that the impacts on those other areas that then come back onto the children of our society as well. Many of those women, of course, everyone's remarking on, isn't it amazing they've popped up as homeless? Well, when you have a look at the lives, I mean, they've had, you know, they've taken the lane to care for the children. That's why they don't have as much super. That's not a sort of miracle. It's because they were out of the workforce looking after the children. Then, you know, maybe often a marriage breakup where some sort of dumb family law thing of each gets half if everyone's doing well, and yet, you know, you still get to keep the children and have to look after them for the rest of their growing up. That takes more than half. So it's no wonder that those grandmothers, those women, are in the predicament they're in. As I say, a passion project at the moment. But yeah, look, and the blindness to those sort of impacts and what they're going to mean in a decade or two is something that we've got to lift. We've got to stop that. Yeah. Now I want to talk a little bit about the rental reforms that are coming through. Many of you, I hope, will have heard about the Victorian Housing Statement. It's just over a year old now. It was one of the last things that Premier Andrews did before he resigned, and it was passed over very firmly to the incoming Premier, Jacinta Allen, and many ministers actually have a responsibility for pieces of it. It's for someone who's been in the housing sector and advocacy for a long time, 1989, I'll out myself, when the first baby was not one, is a remarkable thing that, you know, here we have underpinning the Victorian government's, you know, legislative and policy agenda, housing. Unfortunately, it's a reflection on how bad things have got, but I do say to you all as members and advocates in turn do look at it and do think about what you can talk to your policymakers and representatives about from your perspectives, because it is an important piece of work. So in the rental space, the drive continues to try to make private rental in particular, which is where most renters live. Social housing is very, very important and must be paid attention to and kept growing and kept good. But really, most people do live in private rental. The drive is all towards making every house a home. And that's, I think, what we're all talking about today, is how children can have solid homes from which to have a base of life. The first of those reforms were passed in 2018. And that's actually when this commissioner role was created and I was appointed. And Victoria went first with that. New South Wales has now done the same. But the idea is that renters need to, be seen as kind of real people, I suppose, with entitlements to a say and more rights. Essentially, here comes the rights. Yeah. So there's some things that have been important already. So, for example, notices to vacate, which is the most feared thing, I think, now need to be accompanied by actual evidence. So if an owner wants you to leave your property because they want to sell it, they actually need to send evidence that they are really going to sell it instead of just asserting that. If the owner wants you to leave because they want to move in themselves or a relative, they need to establish that that's a close relative that they've got a relationship of care for, or that they really are going to move in themselves, not just assert it again. There's been almost a removal of the so-called no reason notice to vacate. Those nerds, policy wonks who follow it, will see that New South Wales is about to remove that entirely. The ACT have, and maybe Victoria will consider that too. But it's almost out of the system, where just that sense is, I'm the owner, this is my property, I really don't need a reason to ask you to go. I'll give you a no reason notice to vacate. It's limited in its use now, but it's still there. There's a really important new thing called the reasonable and proportionate test, which when evictions go to a hearing at VCAT, the VCAT member hearing that has to consider whether the action being taken is reasonable and proportionate to the circumstances. And there's been some really interesting cases where the member has said, well, no, I don't think that eviction is a reasonable and proportionate response. I think that the situation they're reacting to can be addressed another way. So that's really is a sort of growth of the concept that renters have a right to that housing, as long as, you've got to pay your rent, you can't damage it. All those sort of things, of course, are part of the obligation. But there is a growing sort of sense, I think, in Victoria, and practical application of that sense of the importance of housing and that people need to have that available. There's more home-like things, such as the presumption that you can keep a pet, and that if an owner objects to that, they need to actually make a case for that objection, rather than the tenant having to make a case for the pet. So that's important home-like stuff. And that you have the right to small alterations, hanging pictures, sensible modifications for your and your family's needs. These are all in the law now. Of course, the family violence measures went into the Residential Tenancies Act as a result of the Royal Commission. And these, I think, I'd be really interested in a review to see how well they're going. But that's a very important set of provisions for families to protect children in those sort of really difficult circumstances. One of the big things that's coming down the pipeline is an introduction of alternate dispute resolution for tenants, and that should make it easier, if it's designed well, for tenants to actually get the rights that I've described. Because one of the problems we have, of course, is that people feel intimidated, not wrongly necessarily, to actually exercise their rights. People mistake it and think people just don't know that they can do something about X. Well, actually, people do generally find that out. but then they make a calculation about whether that's a good idea to exercise the right, or whether that will sour the relationship and at some stage come back on them in an adverse way. And in a very, very tight rental market, which we are talking about across Australia, across many parts of the world, actually, that calculation becomes more consequential, unfortunately. So around 40% of rental households in Victoria, private rental households, do have children living there. So that's, over 285,000 households have got dependent children there. So yeah, all these reforms, and there are more. If you're a real policy one, do yourself a favour and go have a look. It is all about homemaking, easing financial pressure, trying to address some of the discriminatory factors as well that households suffer from. But the big problems remain of rising rents and the sale of investor properties. One of my favourite stats is, it's not a good stat, is that within 5 years in Sydney and Melbourne, over half rental properties are sold on. So basically investors are not holding their properties long term in many, many cases. And that makes a hard foundation to build stability on in the private rental sector. So that's something that I think policymakers as well need to have in mind, because those investors who offer that housing into the private rental market might be great, but if at some point it's all about the sale, and we can understand that's the wealth creation part of housing that was mentioned earlier, then it all becomes uncertain again. Just I want to turn briefly to interesting housing models and work as well that really are keeping children and being effective parents in mind. So there's an amazing development down in St Kilda called the Botanical Apartments. It's run by the community housing agency called Housing First. Launch is involved as support providers, and it really focuses on women who are pregnant and homeless, and then bringing the babies home and having that stability for the first year in the apartments. Maternal and child health are involved. The Royal Women's Hospital are heavily involved, and then on to the next thing after that period of stability against the storm. That's the sort of thing we need a lot more of. I'd also call out Viv's Place in Dandenong, which I know Bronwyn Pike has a lot to do with, from Uniting and obviously Launch, and that's all about families and providing stability again, to be able to settle everything, raise the family. So that focus is the sort of thing that I hope more social housing projects will do, and think about how they link with the necessary support as well to provide that. There's also a Pregnancy and Homelessness Coalition. I don't know how many of you are involved in that, but I've kept involved in that. It's not really much to do with the Residential Tenancies Commissioner, but it's a personal, passion. We don't know because we don't count, but we are pretty sure that you're more likely to be homeless when you're pregnant than not, the mainstream population. That's certainly true in other countries, and one of the prongs we're trying to work with is to actually get that question asked. We're also trying to get homeless agencies more capable and able to respond to what that answer is, and similarly on the healthcare side, to get those practitioners much more alert to homelessness and its impacts. So that's another really interesting one. You will all probably know about youth foyers, and it's great to see the growth of the youth foyers. Therefore, for children still, older children and emerging adults, that they're really, really important to kind of right some of that stuff that hasn't gone well so far, to do with education, training, just getting a better start to life and launch off. And I mean, I can't not say social housing in general, really, for the stability, the affordability of it. These are the characteristics that all housing needs. You need to be the one who decides to leave, not your landlord deciding you'll leave as I say, as long as you pay the rent and all that. Yeah. So just a few remarks now, I guess, to finish about housing as a human right. Now, it's never been made fully law, domestic law in Australia. Australia has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, under which the right to housing sits, but we've never exactly fully written it into law. And I know that's what advocates are pushing for, and that's, as Deborah marked, a live conversation at the moment. I would say that in the sort of common conversations, the rights discussion really needs to be constantly dragged back to what it's actually about, because it tends to be, well, my right as a landlord is to be boss of that house, or my right as, there's a common kind of use of the term right. That isn't what the United Nations means at all. And, that can get quite muddy and contested. And so I think there's a really significant effort that we all have on, no, hang on. What we mean is, and just keeping that conversation there as much as possible. I want to offer another concept for you, which I kind of really, really like. I don't mean instead of the human right one, by the way. I think that's fundamental. But housing as an essential service is an extremely interesting concept, I reckon. You can't just get your electricity or your water turned off without extensive efforts by the company to work with you on repayment plans, to make sure that there's some way that you can, retain that service, as long as you know to ask that. Whereas we can still, even with the sort of improvements that I was talking about, you can still be evicted as a family. So I think that essential service concept, which a number of the consumer advocates use, is an interesting one. So I'll recommend that one to you. And I also just want to, I suppose, end with the idea that solid housing for everyone needs to be a universal service. I think in the last few decades, we've put a lot of effort, rightfully, in the sort of very targeted end of housing and homelessness service. Important, essential, but let's all also keep our eye on how it's going for everybody, and to think about not over-targeting, not missing that middle, I suppose, of people who can't purely purchase everything for themselves, and especially with the way prices are going. So that's why I think we're seeing the problems that we've got now, that taking our eye, I suppose, off the universal service, universal right side of things. Look, Deb, I'll finish there and give the floor back to you and the others, but they're just a few thoughts I had for you today. I hope of use to you.
Oh, Heather, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You've got me sort of quite excited about the conversation in a good way, because it really, the housing and homelessness space does elicit a lot of passion from those of us that worked in that space. But your knowledge is so deep, and so I've got some questions, and I'm happy to see if there are any from the floor. I do think Heather's comments about really knowledge yourself up about what is in the current legislation on what the rights of your current clients are vis-a-vis their tenancies, because yes, you can refer a family on to a housing and homelessness provider or a tenancy advocate, but know your stuff in this space, because I'd have to say some of the changes, like being able to have a pet and a range of other things, have been really life-changing for some of our vulnerable families. And let's not understate how important. I remember when they came in, Heather, the people around me who were renting were really thrilled. So, let's not move on from those things too quickly. Let's at least sort of acknowledge the changes they've made. From my perspective, how do you, when we talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about the sale of properties. So investors are selling on their properties quicker than they ever have in our history. And this is more of a personal comment. I mean, as people age and are going into aged care facilities, they often sell their homes. And that's a huge part of the market now as people live for longer. Do you get the opportunity to be in those conversations about how aged care policy impacts investor selling on? Are you able to get into those? Because your place in those conversations are really important, because all of these things are linked, are they not?
Well, that's a good idea, Deb. I haven't been. I've been thinking about the people who are older who are renters and who are, having that sort of problem. But I think you're quite right. And I suppose I also think it's really hard to stop that sale of properties, because sometimes it's just that the market's rising. And so it's actually a good time to sell and realise your asset. But that point you make about people selling out because they need the money for aged care, I'll look into that. That's a great point.
I mean,
Thanks.
in my situation, my parents would have rented their property but couldn't afford to because they needed to pay for their aged care. So I think that it really does, it is impacting the rental market. A lot of us would much prefer if we had the capacity to rent out a property than sell it, for the very reasons we're here today. So it is sort of an interesting conversation, because all of these levers do impact each other. Now, I can see Jenny with her hand up, so I'm gonna see if Jenny wants to make a comment or ask a question. Thanks, Jenny.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Heather. It's so nice. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work you're doing. I have, been seeing problems for a long time, and it's nice to start to see some solutions. And I'm interested Jacob Kane, the president of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, recently published an op-ed, and I actually had just met him prior to it. And he suggested that a solution to the short-term nature of rental agreements was to have sort of a scale where the longer you're at rent, if you had a 5-year lease, you'd have a reduction on land tax. If you had a 10-year lease, you'd have more. Now, obviously, that's going to be undermined by the churn in ownership of rental properties. But do you think that is a workable lever, or are there others that would help with these issues?
I read that. Hi, Jenny. I read that op-ed with great interest too. He was comparing it to sort of commercial leases, anyone who's been involved with those. It could. I mean, again, in the 2018 reforms, longer leases were made much more possible, but they just haven't been taken up. So I think that sort of consideration of why not, what it would take, is really, really valuable. And I think that we need to I think that we need to kind of investigate what the reasons are that owners have for selling or not selling, and maybe for a quadrant, a section of the owners, that would really be a supportive idea, because we've got to drive towards that, haven't we? Those longer leases that give certainty, including what the rent increases are or aren't going to be as part of it. Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That's a great question.
Thanks, Jenny. We've got a question in the chat that relates to the role of the Commonwealth, Heather, and given that hopefully each of the states and territories are going to have a role like your good self, how do we influence those Commonwealth levers, particularly about things like rent assistance and income support? They are fundamental, are they not, to sort of people's rights to be able to live a decent life, to have enough income. And Jenny and I have been in these spaces around a whole range of these things over the last 4 or 5 years, but particularly rent assistance, being able to cover the costs of the increased costs for renters. Again, I mean, it's a Dorothy Dixer, really, isn't it, Heather? But how do we ensure that our commissioners are in that space, influencing government around these things as much as sort of we are? But it just doesn't keep pace, does it, rent assistance?
Good question, Deb. It has just gone up again. The last time it went up, the rent report, which comes out every quarter, again, policy wonk alert, have a look at that at Homes Victoria's website. It took a whole heap of people who were renting, it took them up out of unaffordability. So even those changes that none of us as advocates think are enough, it is pretty remarkable to see, and that's a more universal type solution of which I was talking about. So they are important measures, and it's great to see a second increase. Where the Commonwealth have really stepped in lately is with the what is it called? Not COAG, but it's the, yeah, I think it is COAG actually. So the states, territories and Commonwealth get together, the ministers respectively from each of those jurisdictions. That's been revived and is happening again. And so the statements that come out of there around rent reforms, that's what got reflected and a bit more in the Victorian housing statement. Just the other week, Stephen Jones said that he wanted to look into retirement housing options, retirement villages and residential parks, which are, I don't know if you've seen Adele Ferguson's pieces about that, the journalist. They're catching a lot of older people into poverty traps, actually. So the fact that the federal minister has said he wants to work with his state and territories on better regulation and protections for them, that's the sort of thing that's actually pretty exciting when the Commonwealth does step in there, because they're also saying they'll do what they can with the levers they've got, Deb, as well as, because, you know, federation being federation, there's certain things that can only happen at different levels. But when you see that sort of leadership across the country, everyone doing something about it, it makes it easier in each jurisdiction.
It does indeed. And you are right. I mean, this is such a hot issue when you see government is doing something which is terrific. And this has got such a long tail, hasn't it, Heather? I mean, this has been a problem coming as an advocate that's worked in this space most of your life. This has been a long time coming, hasn't it? And so it's going to take some time to sort of, you know, steady this really big ship that has gone off course. Are there any other questions before we wrap up with Heather? There's a couple of comments in the chat. There is, you know, I must say that this is a hostile debate at sometimes, isn't it? Like, you know, you see, there's always somebody to blame for the reason we've got problems in housing, and I suspect, you know, it's all layers. So I do like these comments in the chat around just really thinking about the symptoms and that we've all got a part to play in resolving these things. There is this question from Michelle. Any thoughts on how to help mothers who are homeowners with mortgages and are at risk of losing their home from family violence, with a focus on the importance of stable housing for children? How can we help them too? This has been a topic of conversation over many years. Any final comment from you on that, Heather, before I wrap this session up?
Yes, thanks, Deb. That's a great question, Michelle. Yeah, I think that the financial counselling sector especially are working with the banks and other financial institutions on how they do that better, and whether there is sort of some support products that are much easier to get to. I suspect it's probably going to have to be some mortgage relief type of funding temporarily as well, because if you can save that, you know, and not have to sort of leave that house, sell that house, sort of, it's just a terrible situation. And I think that the yield on that sort of intervention would be very, very worth doing. Yeah, so I do think that's a promising one. I don't know that there's any work going on it exactly, but I know the financial counsellors are very keen on that.
Yeah. That's why we're lucky to have Heather, because even though she's the Commissioner for Renters, she can pretty much answer most questions on anything housing and homelessness related. So it is just indeed to have her, please. So lovely to have you with us this morning, Heather. Can we give Heather that sort of virtual round of applause or thanks for spending some time with us this morning? It's been lovely to have you here, Heather. And I think you've given us all a lot of options about some ways forward, some things we must do to support the campaign to improve the lives of women and children who are struggling in the housing space. So thank you so much. All right. And Sharon Bassell has put a lovely comment in the chat as well. So thank you. Now we're on to our panel, and now I'd like to introduce them to you. So we'll start with Tanya Corrie. She's the CEO of Juno and the chair of the Women's Housing Alliance. Tanya strongly believes the path to social justice and equity is through systemic change. She's undertaken policy research and advocacy work in research centres, social justice organisations, and has been in a number of ministerial advisory roles. So she's been around the traps, Tanya. She knows the way around this space. So we're lucky to have Tanya with us this morning. Jay Church is with us this morning. 20 years experience in the sector, starting as a youth worker and now joined with the collective privilege of the statewide children's program coordinators this year in an active role which advocates for the rights of young people and children and supports the service sector. The centre regularly meets with the statewide Children's Resource Program, and we're loving hearing about the amazing work Jay and her colleagues are doing in this space. And the Honourable Bronwyn Pike AO has extensive experience across the public, private and community services sector as the Victoria State Member of Parliament for Melbourne from 1999 to 2012. Bronwyn's parliamentary career includes 11 years as the Minister for Housing, Aged Care, Community Services, Health, Education and Skills. She had most portfolios, did Bronwyn. She has a wealth of knowledge across the ministerial space, but also the not-for-profit space in running one of our largest not-for-profits across the country. Lovely to have the three of you here today. Now, each of you are going to speak for about 10 minutes and share your insights with us from different perspectives on the topic of housing and security as a right. And then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A. And hopefully we don't get any curly questions from the people that are here this morning, but I'm sure that you can manage those curly questions should they come through. So who would like to go first? I'm going to give you options. Will we start with you, Tanya? Oh,
sure. Yes, I'm happy to go first.
So over to you, Tanya, in terms of your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wait for the slides to come up. So thank you for inviting me. This is an amazing conversation, a really important and timely conversation, I think. Just a little bit about the Women's Housing Alliance. If we can move to the next slide. So the Women's Housing Alliance came together in 2019, and it came together as a group of organisations who work specifically with women and children around the shortage of housing and the lack of a gendered analysis and a gendered lens on housing policy and housing programs. So we're a growing group of organisations, and our purpose really is to do that advocacy, and we've been fortunate recently to get some funding from Phyllis Connor to do some co-design work around developing a housing model, support model, supply model for women non-binary folks. So some of what I will reference today will be from some of the work that's been coming through those conversations that's given us some amazing insights. So the reason we advocate so strongly for the need for a gendered analysis is, I think it's fair to say the homelessness in the housing system, when you're at when you are homeless, isn't particularly a fantastic experience for anyone. But I think for women and their children, they're often seen, well, they're not seen by the homelessness system. So, we know that women are more likely to present for support housed, but perhaps in insecure housing, couch surfing. They're not going to sleep rough. They're not going to be visible to us, and so therefore we often don't realise that how much of a gendered issue it is. And as we know too, so many of the women who come for support are also parenting children as well, and not having that connection to home can also mean removal of the children and the disruptions that come with that. So it's really interesting that, and this is some data that came through the census, but 81% of the increase in people experiencing homelessness between the two census period were women. And we know about 58% of the clients who are seeking support from specialist homelessness services are female. We don't collect the data about whether trans women, non-binary folks and gender diverse people. I know that's a piece of advocacy we've all been doing, but the research that has been done indicates that they also experience homelessness at higher rates as well. So it's for those reasons, I guess, we've come together to highlight the challenges, but also sort of try to come up with solutions that are driven by the people who have actually experienced the issues themselves. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about this idea of housing as a human right, and I absolutely do support the idea. I agree. I think Heather raised really importantly earlier that we have to really fundamentally better understand what we mean when we say human right. I also think that it is it's a way to start to change the culture, which it's a very little use unless culturally we can shift our mindsets as a country and as people around how we view housing. And I think it's a really important way you can start that process. So like with anything that is a bit complex, I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I absolutely think it's a really, really fundamental and important thing for us to do. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm sorry, the one after that one. Through that one. Thank you. So I guess in terms of, you know, our thinking around that, and the Alliance did put in a submission to the bill, that what it helps us do, as I said, is start to drive that cultural change. I think definitions really matter. And although, you know, if you look at the actual definition of homelessness in most things, the experiences of women and non-binary folks is inclusive. It does actually include experiences of couch surfing, insecure housing and unsafe housing. But when it gets to the service system end, and again, I think this supports what Heather was saying before, you get to the point where it becomes so targeted that actually nobody really gets through. And so the experience of a lot of the people we've been talking to, and the quote that sort of stands out is, I wasn't homeless enough. So, you know, coming in and presenting for support and being turned away because because they weren't at the absolute pointiest end of things. But then the other challenge is when you really are at that pointiest end, the complexity means that you're often also excluded from the service system as well. So we've got a bit of a challenge, I think, with that. And from our point of view, too, and, you know, I strongly believe that it's also about understanding that the drivers of women's homelessness is different, and gender inequality is absolutely at the core of it, and experiences of family violence are obviously a symptom of that as well. But, you know, the growing cohort of older women is a really good example of that, taking time out to care for family and then retiring with less super, again, not having quite enough to purchase a home, not earning enough to necessarily get approved for a rental. It is that kind of not homeless enough group that we're really, and they're just a growing and growing group. And so I think the other thing that I think is really important about this reframing is it puts the accountability back to the system that's creating the outcomes, rather than the individual to have to continue to navigate it. It's about saying, as a community, as a country, as people, this is a right that people have access to. We're not doing them a favour by allowing them to be housed. This is something that they have a right to access. And so I think that's a really important thing to start to shift that mindset as well, because again, the experiences we see too often are people just feeling like, I have to manoeuvre myself to fit into the boxes of the system that's created the outcomes that I'm experiencing at the moment. So so yeah, I do think it's a really important step, and I think from a gender perspective, and we absolutely just need to also maintain that the drivers of homelessness, gender inequality for women, is also a really important aspect of that human rights approach. And so yeah, for those reasons, I think we're generally very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. We'll round that out now and we'll keep moving forward. Thank you, Tanya. I really appreciate that. And I think that your comment about not homeless enough is really terrifying. So we'll pick some of this stuff up in the chat later. So now, Jay, you're up next. Are you happy to proceed?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Kate. My role is a statewide children's resource program coordinator. I am situated out at Gippsland. We have 8 coordinators across the state. So just a little bit of background about the program. The statewide children's resource program is funded by DFFH to assist, support and resource specialist homelessness services and other non-government agencies and sectors to respond effectively to the unique needs of infants, children and young people who have experienced homelessness and or family violence. The role is flexible enough to meet the needs of the region, and some of the work that we do is involved also in secondary consult with agencies, discussing complex cases, providing training and resources, networking and advocacy. We have developed a number of resources and toolkits for practitioners to assist them with their work with infants, children and young people. And we have brokerage that provides opportunities for infants and children to access goods, services and experiences to engage in positive childhood activities. Our philosophy is to advocate on behalf of children and young people in the homelessness and family violence sectors. We uphold the rights of children as stated in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so when we're looking at this through the lens of reframing housing as a human right, we come to Article 24 of the children's rights, which looks at them having a right for a clean and safe environment. It is also the theme for Children's Week next week. So what we know in our work, as we've done our report and reviewed the findings and the data, is that families are struggling with the increasing cost of living, and this is impacting on them being able to provide for their children. So we're seeing applications come in for brokerage to assist with educational costs, parents not being able to meet the cost of school camps, so we're subsidising there, and also extracurricular activity, which is really important for children's social and emotional development. A child's development can be significantly impacted through the experience and the trauma of homelessness. If a child has experienced something traumatic but has a nurturing and responsive support system in place, they are likely to respond and cope more effectively than a child with a fractured and unsupported relationships. The impacts can vary across different ages and stages. From the perspective of a child, homelessness can mean no quiet space for emotional regulation or study, disrupted sleep routines, unlikely to have friends to come over and play, having limited possessions or losing important possessions, impacts on mental health and well-being, and food insecurity. Children of all ages experience homelessness and may present with low and emotional well-being, feelings of displacement, decline in mental health, anxiety and stress, attitudes, behaviours, education attainment, social life, and poor health and hygiene. It is enormously challenging for a child to thrive in these circumstances without significant structured support in place. They may exhibit feelings of confusion, shame, embarrassment, guilt, anxiousness, and profound grief and loss. By identifying and providing the earliest possible opportunities for intervention, it is possible that this will prevent harm and/or trauma and potential engagement with statutory services. It is an opportunity for us to break the cycle of disadvantage and uphold the rights of children to have and access a clean and safe environment, with hopes of contributing towards improving children's health and well-being. Involving infants, children and young people in decisions that impact on their life and well-being is really important. It is a fundamental right to receive supports from services and keep them safe from harm. Children are experts in their own life. They're agents capable of contributing to decisions that affect them, and children are more likely to engage with effective supports if they are active participants. For children to thrive, they need to live in an environment of relationships that start with their family and extends out to community. Their relationships need to be invested in their development. Child-led practices is a way of working with families, both formally and informally, across service systems to enhance their capability to care and protect their children. It focuses on children's safety and needs within the context of their family and communities and builds on families' strengths to achieve optimal outcomes. It challenges us all to think about what the world is like for the child and to privilege their voice and experiences. So for further information on the statewide children's program, I've included a link on the slide. And as I mentioned, in our resources kit, there is resources in folders on infants, children, young people, resources for practitioners and caregivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. That's fantastic. It was very, very useful. The children's resource workers have been around since I was a wee lass working at Council to Homeless Persons, so they've got a really, really long, rich history and have been a focus of attention in the homelessness and housing space for a really, really long time. So you've got a really, really important voice. So thank you, Jay. Really appreciate hearing from you. If there are comments or questions, please pop them in the chat because we can round the session out with making sure that we get those things answered. We now have the wonderful Bronwyn Pike to come and speak with us. I mean, Uniting run an enormous network of children's services through the early years space as well. So it'll be interesting to hear Bronwyn's reflections from both what I call a specialist targeted perspective, but also from that mainstream perspective. I'm a bit of a fan of the Child Youth and Family Services platform offering mainstream services as well as our specialist services. So it's great to hear from you, Bronwyn, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thanks very much, Deb, and good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land and pay respects to elders past and present. And as I said, thanks, Deb, and to Heather and Tanya and Jay and the whole team at the centre. It's terrific that you've organised this event. I also want to thank my co-chair for Anti-Poverty Week, David Tennant. David and I have been in this role for a few years now, and I'm really delighted that Anti-Poverty Week is the context for raising these very important issues about housing. This year at Uniting, we decided that Anti-Poverty Week was a chance to actually pause and look back a bit and reflect on the work that has been happening over many, many years to reduce poverty in our country. And, you know, we feel at this point in time that our newspapers and our media and our experience as service providers is absolutely consumed with the cost of living and housing crisis. And it would be very easy, I think, for us to think that these are new problems and somehow we have to then go out and create new solutions. And there's an element of truth in that. I mean, every context is somewhat different, but in fact, the challenges that we face are decades in the making, and some of the work that has been done previously is just as relevant today as it was half a century ago. And on your screen, you will see that, of course, since the early 70s, there have been successive federal inquiries, commissions and select committees and reviews asking the very same questions that we are asking today and receiving evidence and answers on how we address poverty and the housing crisis in Australia. So we've got an extract here from the Henderson inquiry, which was from 1973 to 1975, and the 22-24 Senate Standing Committee on Community Affairs Poverty inquiry from a few years later, more recent times, I should say. And, you know, if you actually read them, it's breathtaking, the similarity. In fact, I actually remember a few years ago seeing this incredibly telling cartoon. There were two little children and they were clearly very impoverished and homeless, and they were knocking on the door of a welfare provider, and the kindly social worker said to them, "Oh my goodness, you know, you look so cold. How do you possibly keep warm?" And they said, "Oh, it's easy. We just wrap ourselves in the papers that we find in the inquiries into child poverty, and that'll keep us warm." So, you know, I think it is a very sanguine kind of message that both these inquiries found that families were struggling to meet the basic costs of food and shelter and transport and utilities. And of course, households that rent made up a significant proportion of those living below the poverty line. In fact, the Henderson inquiry said that while renters comprised 21% at the time of households, overall they constituted 40% of all households living below the poverty line. And, you know, we'll get sort of similar figures in this particular generation. It's interesting at the time too that one of the recommendations from the Henderson inquiry was not to align the increases in social security to the consumer price index, but that because of that fact that the rise in food prices, of course, is disproportionately felt by people and housing prices for that matter, for people of limited means because of the greater proportion that they need to expend on those things. I guess the other thing that was being tackled at that time, and we still have to face, is that, you know, poverty and homelessness are often blamed on personal choices. That is, you know, part of that kind of view of, you know, we make our own lives, we make our own world, we're given all the same opportunities. And we know, of course, that that's completely untrue, that there are incredibly big structural drivers for people that keep people entrenched in poverty and hardship, and that whilst we want to focus today on the housing issue, the reality is we have to dismantle the systemic barriers, and our education system is one of those classic examples where we are one of the very few countries in the world that provide funding to private education. It's one of the strongest drivers of social inequity in this country, and yet it's seen as something that's too hard to tackle. The way that we ensure that people have a fair go is, of course, you know, a much more kind of comprehensive look at all the drivers that keep so many people in poverty. When we look back on past inquiries, our current cost of living and housing crisis seem less of a crisis and more business as usual, a natural byproduct of what it means to live in a liberal democracy that doesn't have the checks and balances that are often required. And of course, you know, we're hearing a lot in the conversations about the American election about that notion of aspirational becoming desperational. And, you know, I think it's a very important reflection for us that we have a system that is built on personal aspiration. But of course, we need to every now and then say, well, is this really working for us? Or is it, of course, driving people into more desperate and impoverished situations? I think that overall, you know, what we often do in these kind of debates is that we address individual issues one at a time. So say, let's have a conversation about the lack of supply. And of course, that's real. But if we think we've got problems, I heard today that in the UK, last year, their population grew by 750,000 people, and their new houses built were 20,000. So, as Heather reminded us, this is a global challenge. But you know, we also think if we sort out capital gains and negative gearing, that'll be the silver bullet. Or if we get rid of all the migrants coming in who are stealing all our houses, that'll be the silver bullet. The reality is we do have to have a long-term strategic focus, and we as a community have to encourage our leaders to have much more direction and much more ambition. And I think someone actually did put in the chat, that it's not just, it's easy, and you expect me to say this, it is easy to say that it's all politicians' fault. And I think it is true that politics does get in the way of good policy many, many times in this country. But politics is also driven from the ground up. It's also a reflection. I mean, just ask Bill Shorten, who tried to change some of the tax arrangements and lost the election. It is a reflection on our national aspirations, what emerges from us as a community. Too often we actually see the stalling of essential reforms that would create immediate and meaningful change, because what we really are asking people to do when we talk about human rights is we're asking the best of people. We're asking people to set aside self-interest. We're asking people to think about the good of society, and we're asking people to be compassionate and humane to their fellow citizens. And that's sometimes personally costly for people. And until we have a national conversation that says, if we really are serious about having a human right for housing, if we're serious about having more equity, if we're serious about addressing policy, then that's a challenge for all of us, and for those that have plenty, so that we can create a culture of sharing and a more equitable distribution of resources. And you just need to pick out a little quote from the Henderson Inquiry that 50 years ago that said all of those things. To give conscious priority to the poorest in our community involves big changes in the way we conduct social policy. Now, of course, we as a community sector, do have a very significant role in reframing the narrative around economic and political issues. And I would say that we don't need a lot of more evidence. Of course, having data and everything is incredibly important, and being able to give substance to the arguments that are being made. But in the end, we have a lot of evidence. We know what the challenges are. We know what the problems are. We just need to be bolder. We need to be more consistent. We need to lead by talking about what collaboration and respect is. And we need to evidence that trickle-down economics doesn't work. It doesn't work for particularly the most vulnerable in our community. So the human right to housing is a very powerful narrative, but I think if we've learned anything from the Voice referendum, we've learned that being on the side of right and having a powerful narrative needs a lot more than just a group of people from the community sector saying, yeah, this is how it should be. We do need to expect more from the leadership in our country, but we also need to expect more from each other and more from our community. The next federal election, early next year, I think, the government will inherit a surplus, maybe longer term deficit, but a surplus, but also the challenge of managing 50 years, I think, of failing to really address some of the fundamental inequities in our society that now has left millions of people, 1 in 6 kids, unable to afford the basics for a decent life. And so the advice is there. I think our challenge is to appeal to the best of all of us, not those aspirations that are fueled by fear and greed and self-interest, but those aspirations that we all see within our own families, that we are capable of love and care and compassion. We are capable of caring for humanity. We are capable of respecting the dignity of all people. And we need to continue together to expect that of the leadership of our country and our fellow citizens. And they're the things that will turn the tide and hopefully mean that in 50 years' time, we won't be looking back and saying, gee, we had that great seminar together for Anti-Poverty Week that the centre pulled and nothing's changed. I'm sure it can, and I'm excited about opportunities to work together to make it a reality. Thanks, Deb.
Oh my God, Bronwyn, you're amazing. That was incredible. Thank you so much. Can we give our panel a bit of a round of applause as you do? It's a shame we're not in the room together, but we actually get more people online when we do these things because people are busy. So it's been just powerful to listen to all of the speakers this morning in relation to this issue. So we've got some questions, but we've also got some hands up. So I think rather than me go to the questions I've been given, we've got a hand up. Marie, is it Marie? I just want to see if we can. Maybe you can't hear me. Okay, all right. So what we might do now is I've got a few questions and some of it you've covered, but it's a sort of an opportunity to dig a bit deeper. And I'm sort of thinking, as everybody has spoken, is what can we do to better organise ourselves, Bronwyn, really? Like, what can we do? Like, what can we repurpose? How do we point to the sort of North Star with the sector leaders around some of these issues in an enduring way? Because I think everybody's doing some great work, but after today, I think the conversation is to be, what do we do between now and the next Anti-Poverty Week? Like, what do we do? So I think there's some questions there for me. I mean, having just come back from Europe where they're all over the right stuff, it's actually very tangible. I am sort of interested in this sort of notion of how do we, because I can tell you, people roll their eyes when I talk about children's rights, not this group, but people do roll their eyes going, oh yeah, here she goes again. How are we going to make them more tangible? What are people, and I'm happy to hear from anybody on this. I think that we do as a sector almost do make them tangible, but from a sort of government and policy point of view, they're not often talked about. How do we make them more tangible in this current environment, given that I loved your comment before, we've gone from aspirational to desperational, you know, like really, Bronwyn. Do people have, given that we're talking about rights today, how do we take that forward? Because we're all talking about it, but to be honest with you, everybody we're talking about has an inalienable right. We signed on to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but we still don't uphold them because thousands of them are homeless with their parents generally. So any comments in relation to that question? Tanya, Jay, Bronwyn? It's a hard one, isn't it? Any comments? Oh, put you all on the big screen now, so there's no getting away from, somebody has to answer. Heather, we might start with you. Like, what are your thoughts in this space? Because I think Bronwyn's right. We could walk away from today and do nothing and be waiting again, all do our own individual thing. But given we want housing as a human right, we want to make sure that children's rights are upheld. What do we do now?
I think the advocates and the sectors need to do a bit of organising around it, actually, and bring together the different parts of it. You represent the children and families, Deb, and it's almost maybe through VCOS. I don't know what the sort of way to go is, but to really sort of get some consistency about what's being asked for, why, and I kind of take Bronwyn's comment about, you know, the voice as well. You know, there was a pretty clear imperative there for me. I thought it was pretty clear, but you know, that sort of real organising and patience to do that, I think, and to persuade, to persuade the people of the community, not just to sort of direct it into government, I think is extremely important. So I think it's, you know, there was a lot of excitement when the rights language really came forward about 20 years ago into our space. I think we need to re-find that excitement and do a lot of spade work, actually, and think about it being directed into the community in which we all live. That's all I could think to say there, Deb.
Thank you, Heather. Look, we've had this group for some time called Treating Families Fairly, and David Tennant was the chair. He's probably on this call. So there is some things we could repurpose. So I'm sort of thinking along those lines. I go straight into action. The whole time I've been listening to all of you thinking, what do we do now? Any other comments in relation to that, Bronwyn? Tanya, you want to go next?
Yeah, I agree in terms of organising. I think too, nothing makes things real than listening to people who have actually been through it and experienced it. So I think being able to prioritise that voice of lived experience of children. I mean, I know you probably all know Connor Paul, and you've got, you know, Tash Anderson and all these amazing young people who speak up, and I think that's really hard to ignore when you've got somebody who actually has had that experience. So I do think there is a space for that, and that's often, you know, changing hearts and minds. We can rationalise it, talk about it in kind of esoteric terms. It is a very hard concept to kind of get your head around, because it is kind of very cerebral. So I think that's one way. And the other thing I think is, and one of the things I think that works in our favour for this one is, it is an idea we can all coalesce around as a sector, whereas I feel like the challenge we did have with the voice is sometimes the progressive, when as a progressive group of people we can't reach a consensus or an agreement, and that's so important, because otherwise we start to undermine each other and things like that. And I'm not, you know, casting aspersions on people who do that, but like, I'm not disagreement, because I think it's important and healthy to have. But I do think one of the benefits I think we do have is, you know, it's very hard to argue that children deserve to be treated as humans, but perhaps there is still that undercurrent of children should be seen and not heard, and perhaps, you know, being able to make decisions on behalf of. But I do think we've moved along, and I think with some good organising and some listening, I think there's capacity for some change there.
I know, Tanya, I can be in plenty of meetings where nobody ever talks about a child, and yet we're talking about children's services. So we actually do have an awfully long way. I can tell you every day it's quite distressing. And it's because they are still probably chattels of adults. And I think people go, if the adults are okay, the kids will be okay. And there's some merit in that. Bronwyn, your comments about appealing to the best of us, I think, are very well said at this time, because there's very divisive behaviour out there in political land, in a range of other spaces. I think what you're saying, or are you saying, as a sector, we really need to hold that ground, because that's the space in which we can be very powerful when it comes to advocating, no matter what it is, but particularly in this space. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I actually think that was, I totally agree with you.
And I'm glad, Tanya, you raised storytelling, because the more you can humanise stories and people can hear stories and they can see themselves in those stories, the more powerful that it really is. And I mean, David and I have had a few conversations, you know, as co-chairs of Anti-Poverty Week, you know, feeling a bit, I guess, fair enough, David, to say a bit despondent, you know, and finding it a bit hard to get the energy, because there's a bit of a feeling we're just banging on about the same thing year after year, and people have kind of stopped listening. And it is about rethinking, what are the fundamental messages? We can say 1 in 6 kids who live in poverty. We can throw all the statistics up but people are just numb to it. And, I'd have to say that some of our big advocacy groups, get on them and they'll talk about stats and poverty lines and this above and this and below and all of that sort of stuff. And it's just falling on deaf ears. And so it is really about talking, I think, bigger. What kind of community do we want? Do we really like the fact that kids are living in cars? Is that okay? And look at this kid, and some of the stories, that Jay, you were telling, about children's experiences and Heather, that lack of connectedness and, reliability and what the impacts are of that on people's lives. So, I do think we need a lot of work in thinking about our communications because, personally, I just think that the stuff we bang on about, nobody's listening to.
Mm-hmm.
I know that sounds really cynical, but I think it's the reality because we haven't got a groundswell of people in the community. The bigger message on The Voice was, they're going to come and take away my backyard. That was the voice that won. So
totally.
because I believe people are good and fundamentally can, and we see around the world, we see countries where they have much stronger social policy and safety net mechanism where there is more of a consensus around sharing, etc. But it's some of those really important messages that around sharing and caring, not shaming and blaming and, all that kind of stuff. I personally think we just have to use that kind of language all the time rather than look at how many families are below the poverty line.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting.
Just a personal view.
Well, I think most people would agree with you. I think you've sort of wrapped up the sentiments of how people are feeling right now. Because, very early on in this presentation today, we did start talking about landlords' rights versus children's rights, and they're actually not the same thing, right? So this is where there's just such a distortion, right? And you've got desperate landlords as well as you've got desperate people who are going to become homeless, and are they equal? Well, maybe not. Jay, you haven't made a comment yet. Do you want to make a quick comment in terms of this discussion before I slowly wrap us up?
Thanks, Kate. I think just on the back of what Tanya said, I think what's really exciting at the moment is seeing opportunities for children to be part of projects. So we're seeing children as co-researchers and co-participants, and that their voice, it's giving opportunity for their voice to come into some planning. And I think that's the way forward of, really understanding as a practitioner and coordinator in the sector. We get ideas of what we think children want or what families need. But we've always got to listen. It's always changing, and the context is very different for everybody. So I see that as a very exciting progression forward in understanding and looking for some of those solutions to fix problems.
Thank you, Jay. Well said. David in the comments has said, and I'm wondering, David, do you want to speak your comments or are you happy for me to read them? Because I think where we're heading is a conversation about how we organise ourselves, actually. I think that it's essential. I do get fearful, as in David's comments, that things could continue to deteriorate if we don't do something. But David, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, Deb, with a minute to go, probably not. But I think you're right. It is about seeing these events where we talk to each other and largely share the same view as just a catalyst to get on with things. The time for having discussions that talk about the potential of having a plan is over. We are failing our current generation of kids in the most spectacular way. We have to get active.
Thank you, David. It really is a great way to sort of, normally these things peter out and we don't actually have a clear way forward. But I'm hopeful that some of you will join the centre, and David and Bronwyn and Jenny and perhaps Heather and others and Tanya in thinking about how we need to sort of take this conversation forward, and also VCOS and those that also have the energy for this, because I actually think it is really important. So in many ways, I just want to thank all of the people involved in getting us together today to have this really important conversation, because even though there's lots of work done in the past, as Bronwyn pointed out, I think we actually have to really think now about what we want to do in terms of our next steps and not just do things the way we maybe always have. I sadly have been around a long time and seen and participated in those inquiries and written lots of speeches, and we probably do need to do things slightly differently these days. So look, can I thank everybody and can I thank the committee, the Poverty Committee, and particularly the chairs for allowing us to do this again this year. I'm hoping that this will become a fixture in the centre's calendar, and that in between one event and the next one, that we've actually got ourselves a bit more organised at the centre anyway to do some things that could be more meaningful in this space. Give everybody a round of applause, please. I also want to thank Caitlin. Where is Caitlin? Caitlin from the centre.
Thank you, Deb.
Caitlin, thank you. And we will get an email out to you after today, sort of signalling what we might be able to do next in this space. And I hope that many of you who've shown up today would be interested in participating in that. So thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of the week. Please think about getting on social media, learning as much as you can about the rights of tenants and families who are in rental in this state, so that you can actually individually advocate for those individuals as well. There's a big picture advocacy, but there's also the day-to-day stuff. Heather is there if you need any more in sourcing that material. Thank you, everybody. Please take care.